I first met Francis in 1971. At that time, I was barely 20, and I had been searching my whole life for God, for the trueness, the realness in my life. So I first heard of Maya Baba at a yoga convention in Mooloolaba, and my Baba contact was Liz Gaskin. And I remember seeing her walk up the hill, and there was an immediate attraction for both of us. Perhaps it was a memory from a past life. It was an instant connection, the recognizing of a fellow seeker. And I don't quite remember the details, but I do remember her telling me about Maya Baba and that there was meetings. I went with her to my first meeting to this place, somebody's house, and I remember walking in. It must have been winter. I remember cardigans and heaters on the floor. And seated in that living room, in the lounge room, were the oddest assortment of people you could have ever seen. Of course, I know all of these people now, and they're very dear to me, but at that time, I was a hippie. I had long hair, bare feet, looked, scruffy, and walked into this room. Here was a group of much older people. I mean, they must have been at least 45. When at that time, it was very old. And there was an assortment of very old people. A person sitting in a corner with a blanket wrapped around him, very dirty looking, scruffing hair, John Isaacs. There was Robert and Lorna Rouse, and there was a couple whose house we were at, who were Norm and Hazel Shipway. And there were some other people there, maybe Marge Donaldson, and I can't quite remember who else at the time. And there was a couple of much younger people with young babies who I don't know who they were either. But the night consisted of readings. Oh, and I forgot to mention that there was a person sitting cross-legged on the floor who was very gnome-like. Brought to mind Yoda from Star Wars. Of course, that wasn't in anybody's vocabulary then, but that's what he looked like. He was a little gnome-like figure. And he exuded some kind of authority. It was Francis, of course, but you could tell from the meeting that he was the one, not in charge, but the one to whom people looked to for the answers or answers to a question. So the night consisted of a reading of a Baba book. At that time, there were not very many Baba books around. There was the Everything and the Nothing, not to be confused with Bao's book, The Nothing and the Everything. It was the Everything and the Nothing. There was the Discourses. There was God Speaks. And I think that was pretty much it, other than little pamphlets. So I think at that time we were reading the Everything and the Nothing. So what would happen, the book would be passed around and one person would read a paragraph or two and then pass it on to the next person and the next person, next person, until everybody in the room had their turn. And I remember Francis would be in the corner and he would grunt or nod with recognition, approval, and not of the reading, but of the content of what we were reading. And then after the Baba book, we would read, I say we would read because, of course, I went to subsequent meetings. I can't remember what the book was that we read that first night after the Everything and the Nothing, but it was always a spiritual book, meaning the Conference of the Birds or Monkey or maybe the Greek myths, or Layla and Majnun. And it was always usually, of course, it was a spiritual book. It was a book connected with God and loving God, the love of a spiritual master for their guru, their beloved, the search, the longing.
Did Francis read? Was he one of the people who would read out loud, or he would just listen?
Ah, that's interesting. Did Francis read out loud? No, I don't remember that.
So do you remember the first time you ever exchanged actual words with him about anything, or you just got to know him gradually?
Just got to know him gradually. Francis was not somebody that was entirely approachable. I did talk to him that first night. I was introduced, but I don't remember any lasting conversation that has stayed with me. So that was the beginning. That first meeting was the beginning of my life with Meher Baba. I recognized that Baba was who I had been searching for my whole life, and started to slowly assimilate into the Baba community as it was at that time. And don't forget, this was 1971. Baba dropped the body in 1969. So all of those people that I had met at that young age were still grieving for Baba. He was their friend, their companion, someone who they could write to. He was readily available. Plus, he was God. And he was gone. He was gone physically from their life. And they were just beginning, I think now, to realize that he wasn't gone at all. He was still there. But how do you find him again after he'd been with you physically? And I think they were all still grieving for...
And Francis especially.
And Francis especially. And Francis especially was grieving for this, for his true beloved.
Yeah.
His absolute true beloved. And plus he was living in India with Baba for 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any personal memories of anything Francis said to you personally over the years, or things you learned?
First, let me begin by saying that that meeting, as I said, was the beginning of my life with Meher Baba. And I began to come up to Avatar's abode more frequently during the day. Francis was there alone, always writing. And of course, you never wanted to disturb him. You knew that any disturbance would not be a good idea, because he was so focused on his writings for Baba. Mm-hmm. But at the time that I came, it was the beginning of the young ones. Now we're all the old ones. So there became a group of us who, by the grace of Baba, were able to spend much more time with Francis at Avatar's abode, and that included weekends. So those of us who lived close by would come for the weekend. Those of us who lived in Brisbane would come up for the weekend, and we would spend weekends with him up at Avatar's abode. And they were lovely, lovely times. Most Saturday evenings were spent listening to music that Francis selected himself from his very large range of personal records. And he'd spent a lifetime searching for truth and beauty through art. So his collection of books and records was huge, and it was like you're at a feast and you couldn't wait to devour these incredible things. Mm. So for me particularly, being exposed to music, traditional music like Jamaican tunes and Greek myths and tunes from Spain, Spanish traditional music, and being introduced to the Japanese No theatre and kabuki, and
it's a real education.
And poets like Walt Whitman and Rafferty and Rimbaud and all of these people who, little girl growing up in Brisbane, you don't learn that. You know, you learn Judith Wright and you learn Banjo Patterson. You know, we weren't exposed, at least I was not exposed to that. So it was this whole wonderful world open to me through Francis. So we would sit there on a Saturday night in Barber House and listen. And at that time, now of course, you're only allowed into Barber House for special events. At that time, it was just one big room, and where Barber slept was at the end, and that's where all our meetings were held. That's where the anniversaries were held for many years. And the doors were always open. There was Barber, always there. So we would sit in that room, and Francis would select these records. We would listen to these records. We would ask questions. He would sometimes explain what they were. So that was truly an education.
So do you think the influx of these new young people helped Francis with his grieving? Because
I do think that the influx of newer, younger ones not only helped Francis with his grieving, but the other people too. We were enthusiastic. Our love for Barber, we were on that honeymoon phase. So we brought energy, we brought life, we brought enthusiasm. So I think it brought them out of their grief. And here was all these young and beautiful, ready to do anything for Mayor Barber people. So Francis encouraged us. He encouraged us to sing songs, to write music, to perform plays. I remember one weekend, somebody sang a song. Somebody was singing a song, and Francis was sitting there cross-legged, smoking his cigarette, his little roll-your-own cigarette. And after it was finished, he said, that was very good. Who wrote that? And we said, you did, Francis. And he was quite astonished that he had written that. And that what was so wonderful about him was that humbleness, because everything he did for his beloved. Once it was out on the paper or music, he was ready to go again and create, as he said, more little stone steps, more building blocks to the beloved. And that was really wonderful to see, that humbleness that he had. And you saw it, you see it with all of the Mandali.
Yeah.
All of the Mandali.
Right.
And this was his special way of being a Mandali.
Did he ever sort of discipline you or teach you about?
There's one story I'd like to tell you. Francis didn't tolerate fools. He did not tolerate mistakes easily. It wasn't time. I mean, you know, you were here to do what you had to do, which was live your life for God the way that you should. There's no time for mistakes or idleness. It just didn't exist. So tea, the making of tea was very, very important at Avatar's abode, and of course it still is. Tea would be made in the morning at breakfast time, and it would be made in the afternoon for afternoon tea. Occasionally made in between times, but the morning and afternoon teas were very important. We would take turns making the tea, and I thought I knew how to make tea. I mean, I made it for my dad all the time. But on this particular day, it was my turn to make the tea, and you know, usually you made the tea for 10, maybe up to 10, 12 people, maybe 4, depends who was around. So I made the tea in the little kitchen and brought it out, served it, you know, always with some trepidation, because we all knew how important and particular Francis was about his tea. I served Francis his tea, and as was the habit, picked up the saucer, poured a little bit of the tea into the saucer, picked the saucer up, took a sip, and went, Who made this tea? And I, with a very small voice, I did, Francis. It's not hot enough. Go and make it again. I think that was all he said, but to me, I heard, it's despicable, deplorable, it's disgusting, go and make it again. How could you serve this slop, this... It just wasn't hot enough. So I went back and I made the tea again, and that was a lesson in mindfulness, that in everything you do, be mindful. Don't rush, don't hurry, be mindful. And of course, my reward was bringing him back the remade cup of tea and him taking a sip and the that was reward.
That's great. I heard a rumor that Francis gave you a nickname.
Francis called me Australia's energy. I guess Barbara had named a woman in the United States, Marion Florsheim, who lived in Little Beach, I think, or I don't know, somewhere in the States. He had named her energy. Obviously, she had lots of energy, and I'm sure she did lots of work for Barbara in the United States. I had lots of energy at that time. I still do, I guess, but I always had lots of energy. Anyhow, Barbara called me Australia's energy.
In Francis.
Sorry, Francis. Francis called me Australia's energy, and that was nice. But I always had the undertone that with that energy, I should do something with that energy. Energy uncontained can be very dangerous. Energy contained and focused is very good. So I've always tried to focus my energy into doing what hopefully Barbara would want me to do. Those times at Avatar's Abode with Francis, really the formation of my spiritual life and learning how to love Maya Baba and be in the world. Francis lived only for Maya Baba. Stop it for a minute. So there's another story I'd like to tell you. I can't remember what I was so concerned and worried about at this time. You know, I was 20 years old. Now I look back, it's like nothing compares now with what I thought was so big then. Whatever it was, I was bemoaning to Francis, and I remember saying, I can't wait till I get old. Then I won't have to worry about anything. All of these things, these emotions that I'm experiencing, they'll all be gone. And Francis laughed and laughed and laughed. And I was a little taken aback. Well, why is he laughing? And I knew he was laughing at me in a kind way, but he was laughing at me. And he said, oh no, getting old does not, something like getting old does not dispel your worries or despair. It doesn't go away. And I remember thinking, no, he doesn't know what he means. When I'm old, I won't have to worry about anything. Because I thought as you get older, then, you know, the things that you were experiencing when you were younger just kind of went away.
Tell us about the time you guys took Francis to India.
Around I think it was 1973 or 74, kind of the years have blended together. A group of us went to India and Francis came with us. And Francis hadn't been back to India since 1969 when Barbara dropped the body. And it was pretty exciting going to India with Francis. And from Bombay, we took a train from Bombay to Naga. And the train stopped at Monmouth, which was a splitting place for the trains. And Francis got off, and they had the chai salads and the bustle and the hustle of the railway stations as they are in India. And the train, and Francis got off, and he was totally absorbed in being back in India, the smells, and I think he was drinking a cup of chai in the little clay pots that they would make the chai in, and after you drank the chai, you would just throw the clay cups on the earth, and they would go back into the earth. And I think he was there, and he was having a cigarette and a cup of chai, and the train started to move. And we're like, oh, the train's moving! Francis! Remember Sam Saunders jumped out of the train. Francis! And we're all like, Francis is left in the mother. We've got to... I think what happened was the train jerked a little bit, and it started to go, and then it stopped. But I just heard this panic that how would we explain to the Mandalay that we have Francis in mud? That was funny. I remember that. It was nice going to India and seeing the room that Francis had lived in for most of the 10 years that he had been in India, and written in and been in, and that just gave us a glimpse into more of his life.
Did he stay in that room when you were there on that trip?
Yes, yeah. He always stayed at Brabazon whenever he went back to India. And so being, there's probably lots more other little tiny things that I could tell you, but I think the thing that I want to convey more than anything was how knowing Francis shaped my life as a Baba lover, and how to, I think I've said this before, how to live in the world and be a Baba lover and be surrounded by the beauty of art and poetry and music, and how art and poetry and music can celebrate God in all of us, and just being exposed to that at such an early age, and seeing how that permeated Francis's being. That's who he was. That was his purpose in life. And you've got to read Stay with God. You've got to read The Word at World's End. Those two books, you're never going to find anything that explains the mysteries of the love between the lover and the beloved more than those books do. And I still carry In Dust I Sing with me everywhere. Wherever I go, that's the book I take with me. Because every time you read one of those ghazals, something else will leap at you and speak to you, and it'll be another whole realization again. Oh my God, how beautiful is that? How beautiful are those words that convey the essence of that longing and the love for the beloved. There's nothing, I've never read anything like Francis Brabazon's work to convey that. And I feel very privileged to have spent formative years of my Baba life with him and learning from him. And Jai Mai Baba.
Jai Baba.
One last story I want to share with you, and that is when we would leave on the Sunday to go back to wherever, Brisbane or Nambour or wherever it was, Francis would stand just outside at the top of the road. Now there's a ring road that goes around to Avatars Abode, and you enter down near the library, but then you would come past the Brufords and the top of the Rouses and drive into Avatars that way. And that's the way you'd come in and that's the way you'd go out. And it was never a problem because there wasn't a lot of cars that would come that way. And if their cars came, you knew who they were. So when we left, we would drive out that way. And Francis, just as a Mongoli do in India when you got on the bus, he would stand just at the top, just outside Baba's house at the beginning of the road, and he would wave his arms like this, and we'd be out the window waving to him, and he would continue waving and continue like this until the car was out of sight. And it was such a beautiful, beautiful memory to have of him lovingly waving goodbye. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.